Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. A couple of big-picture international things first before we go to the Australian content. The stalemate in the Middle East continues. Iran at the moment is showing no sign of buckling. And the United States, likewise, does not appear to have substantially shifted its position, though now with the addition from Donald Trump that Iran has not been punished enough, that's the latest from him, that more punishment is deserved because of that country's 47 years of behaviour as a very unpleasant theocratic regime. I just wish he would apply that same logic to Russia. But anyway, there we go. So in the short term, fuel and fertiliser prices look certain to continue to increase in price. Another Trump activity is that 5,000 US troops are now being pulled out of Germany. He's linked this, I think, through a Truth Social post with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz criticising the US handling of the Iran situation, saying that Tehran had humiliated Washington. Apparently, that criticism was not to the taste of Donald Trump, so we've got a bit of retaliation there. But it also comes just a couple of days after another one of his mysterious and, we believe, lengthy phone calls with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Now, it's always been Putin's aim to weaken NATO, particularly by having the US pulling out of Europe. This move, even though the US still has a lot of troops in place, has angered even a lot of Republicans back in the United States. They think they can see what's going on, so we'll see if there's any follow-up to this. But once again, it looks like our closest ally is doing the bidding of Russia rather than acting in the interests of the free world. Now, the timing of this podcast coincides with the online release of the May edition of Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. Please have a read. It's free. I don't know for how much longer. We might have to go to a paywall structure at some point, but please have a look. I wrote a couple of articles, one about the Megami frigate, an agreement. I mentioned the ceremonial agreement being signed in Melbourne, which really doesn't have a lot of substance to it, but there's a bit more information about the Megami itself, which is a technical marvel of a ship, but I've done my best to explain why it will never be built in Australia. That's an area where the department and the government, frankly, have just totally screwed up. Anyway, have a look, and I might discuss further in the next podcast. I also wrote an update on the Hunter frigate program, and there's some good news there where the build is picking up speed. I and a lot of other people have been critical in the past of just how much time it is taking for these ships to be built when the need is quite urgent. Well, with the benefit of a bit of analysis and a bit of thought, some of which should have been more obvious to me, I have to say, this situation has come about once again because of this consistent failure in government policy to establish a continuous naval shipbuilding program. Basically, BAE Systems once again had to start from scratch. New facilities had to be constructed. A workforce had to be recruited and trained. Then there was also a lot of work finalising a very complicated design. So the quick takeaway is that the so-called pulse of shipbuilding, pulse like a heartbeat, when you're moving sections of ship from one workstation to another before they start to be consolidated into much larger blocks, that's been happening at 15-week intervals. Well, it now will soon move to 10 weeks. So that's a noticeable, measurable increase in pace. The big thing for me last week was that James Paterson, the Shadow Defence Minister, spoke at the National Press Club. Again, it's available online. I'd encourage everyone to watch it because it had a lot of content. And I need to start with a disclaimer to head off criticisms about these podcasts being politically partisan, because I, of course, have been very critical of this government, particularly their devotion to the US and I'm about to say some nice things about Shadow Defence Minister James Paterson's National Press Club address. I'm not commenting on government policy more generally. I'm just focusing on defence and national security stuff. And people familiar with my writing will know that in the past I've been extremely critical as well of coalition governments, coalition ministers. I had a couple of public disagreements with Peter Dutton. I thought that he did a terrible job. And so the fact that I'm critical of Richard Marles and, like I say, positive about James Paterson should not be interpreted as some sort of partisan slant on things. So he dealt with a number of issues, putting himself at variance with the position of the government. He said that the US behaviour is clearly becoming erratic and unreliable, and he mentioned the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the former president of Venezuela, and the Israeli and US airstrikes on Iran as probably being outside of international law. Nothing exceptional about that, except that this is not something that the government has dared to say. He also said that back in government, the coalition would move quickly to get defence expenditure to 3% of GDP. He said that more assistance would be given to Ukraine. That's music to my ears, as you know. That's something that I'm very enthusiastic about. And I also noticed a small amount of misreporting, where a couple of newspapers, I think it was Greg Sheridan in The Australian, said that he had advocated the purchase of B-21 long-range bombers. I have to say that is not what Senator Paterson said. What he said was that given uncertainties about the timing of AUKUS and the delivery of nuclear-powered submarines, he's still a believer in that project, by the way, that Australia should be looking at possible alternatives, and one of those possible alternatives would be some B-21 long-range bombers. So some of the reporting sort of implied that this is somehow new or sensational. No, the idea has actually been around for a very long time. I've touched on it in the past. Various academics and the think tanks that Richard Marles so absolutely despises have raised it. And possibly most significantly of all, the US Congressional Research Service, that's the research arm of Congress, very high-powered organisation. I've spoken about it in the past. The CRS has repeatedly, for several years, suggested that when Australia made the decision to commit to AUKUS Pillar One, they did not look at any potential alternatives, and pretty much to the top of the list of the Congressional Research Service is this idea of B-21 bombers. So again, what Senator Paterson had to say there, I thought was very mainstream. It's not particularly novel. But you see, the real significance of this is not so much in the detail, much of which was interesting and much of which I found very worthwhile. What was interesting is that he is really differentiating the coalition from Labor when it comes to defence and national security. And this is a relatively new and I think fairly welcome development, because in the past both sides of politics have been in lockstep, mainly out of a fear that if one side criticises the government for something, the government will respond, well, when you were in government, you were even worse. That's, again, a favourite tactic of Richard Marles and, to a lesser extent, thankfully, Pat Conroy's. Labor have been in government for 4 years now, and so they have to have ownership of this. And I think that, as well, Senator Paterson preempted a bit of this by saying in his speech that, yes, when the coalition were last in government, they could have done better. They did make some mistakes. Anyway, hopefully we will now have a more mature, open and sensible debate. And it's an interesting shift in the dynamics of politics, in the sense that pretty much since the end of the Second World War, it's been the coalition, the Liberal and National parties, that have been strongest in this unshakable belief in the US alliance. And it has been Labor, on a few occasions, who have had their doubts about how reliable the United States would be and whether Australian foreign policy should decouple from that of the US. So we now have a reversal of that situation, with the government absolutely blindly locked into AUKUS and assuring us that everything is going wonderfully well. And it's the coalition saying, well, hang on, this isn't quite as rosy as the government is telling all of us, and we need, first of all, to be monitoring progress on AUKUS much, much more closely to see whether results are being delivered. And we also do need to consider the possibility of some slippage, of some delays, and therefore the sensible thing, as I and numerous others have been arguing for years, is to look at alternatives. What do we do if the nuclear-powered submarines do not arrive, or do not arrive at anything like the expected schedule? So, all good stuff, I think. I also notice an article by Gareth Evans, the former foreign minister, and I'm going to quote from it because it was mainly about foreign aid, but how that links to national security. And I'll quote from it because I think that he made a number of pretty good points. It's reasonably lengthy, but bear with me. This is Gareth Evans. On overseas aid, we have been the worst performed of any rich country donor in terms of the decline in our generosity over the last 5 decades, with a current official development assistance commitment, ODA, of just 0.19% of gross national income against the OECD target level of 0.7%. Of course, we have budgetary stress, but one can't help but be wistful about the difference that would be made by the diversion to this quintessential soft power enterprise of just a tiny proportion of the eye-watering hundreds of billions being devoted to the wholly misconceived AUKUS submarine project. He goes on, neither our Prime Minister, and remember this is a former Labour Foreign Minister saying this, neither our Prime Minister nor Foreign Minister are given to making big visionary conceptual statements, but they could do better than they have done so far in this space. Penny Wong says she doesn't disagree with the concept of good international citizenship, as specifically embraced by the Hawke-Keating and Rudd-Gillard Labour governments in the past, but prefers to use the language of constructive internationalism. That phrase, however, implies little more than a commitment to multilateral institutional process without any real hint as to the ends to which that process should be directed. Anthony Albanese's own preferred shtick of, in quotes, progressive patriotism, while no doubt undeserving of Samuel Johnson's famous riposte to a more cynical earlier user, Samuel Johnson's riposte being patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel, something like that. Anyway, Gareth Evans continues that this notion of progressive patriotism clearly conveys no sense of commitment to any particular international causes or values. He says, my pitch to them both in conceptualising and articulating their approach to Australian foreign policy is to play to their perceived and real personal strengths as thoroughly decent human beings leading a government which is itself basically decency-driven. Albanese has often spoken of kindness, in quotes, as the quintessential virtue and looking after each other as the Australian way. It is not a big step from there to say that we hugely value being perceived internationally as a decent country and that we rank as a core national interest in its own right, ranking alongside physical security and material prosperity, being seen to be a good international citizen. Well, here, I agree with all of that. Now, some people might be tempted to just dismiss Gareth Evans on party political grounds, something I touched on at the start of the podcast. I think it's a mistake to do that. But I also noticed an article by Peter Varghese. He's a former head of DFAT, a well-regarded politically neutral figure, and he had some words to say about AUKUS. I'll explain after reading this quote why I'm slightly labouring the point with both Gareth Evans and now Peter Varghese. He says, first, we must abandon the fiction that he refers to the US alliance, is a guarantee of our security. It never was, and it is an Australian delusion which has never been shared by the US on the few occasions we have tested it. ANZUS is not a substitute for defence self-reliance. Australia cannot be self-sufficient on defence, but we can and we should invest in the capability to defend our continent without relying on the combat assistance of the US or anyone else. Without that capability, our sovereignty is academic. Secondly, we should reverse the drift to forward defence, which has been a feature of the last 3 decades and of which AUKUS is an unarticulated example. We must overcome the view, deeply ingrained in the psyche of Australians, that we are incapable of defending ourselves. The alliance can help with self-defence, but that does not mean we should double down on it. Third, we must abandon the judgment that the maintenance of US primacy for all of the benefits it has brought us is vital to Australian interests. It is not, and to think otherwise is to handcuff ourselves to policies that might make sense in Washington, but which may not serve our distinctive interests. And so the reason why I've taken the time to read those articles out by Gareth Evans and Peter Varghese is to let people know that those of us who think that the US alliance needs to be re-evaluated, we are not cranks on the extreme edge of the political fringe. I think that the views that I and a number of others have been articulating probably aligns more closely with the thoughts and values of most average Australians than the position of the government, which is becoming, as I say, even more extreme in this attitude of devotion to the US, particularly when it comes to the strictly military side of things. Australia could and should be doing a lot more in the domain of self-reliance, self-defence, strengthening the ADF, strengthening local industry, building alliances as well, stronger alliances in the region. Yes, things with Japan are going well, but as I frequently state, there are other countries there. There is South Korea, there is Singapore. And it's, again, for me, very interesting that the coalition now seems to have come to the same conclusion. I don't know whether this has happened just because of internal processes or whether it's what their own private opinion polling is showing them, what the focus groups is telling them, or whether they are listening to all of the various think tanks and retired military figures that the government, and in particular Richard Marles, treats with utter contempt. I suspect it's a mixture of all of those sorts of things. And as I say, I think that it is a welcome development because now, rather than both the government and the coalition singing from exactly the same song sheet and stifling debate about things like AUKUS Pillar One, we now have some cracks emerging, some gaps emerging. Hopefully, that's going to put the government now under a bit more pressure to be more open and transparent with the Australian people if their parliamentary opponents are now going to be raising these issues in question time and using devices like that. Now, having said that, I also have to note for the record that it's 2 years to go until the next federal election. So the good intentions of Senator Paterson have to wait for some time. I also note that ministers very cynically, once they transition from opposition to government, frequently drop their pledges of transparency and budgetary commitments get thrown out the window as well. I hope I'm wrong in this regard, or in this case. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.